How's it going, everyone? The Trout 91 here for a breakdown of Map 1 of the Call of Duty Crown Invitational Grand Final between OpTic Gaming and Millenium. What you're going to see is a breakdown of how Millenium took a strong lead over OpTic before the Green Wall flipped the game on its head and mounted a comeback. Now, before we start, we need to paint a picture. Millenium, the CWL Season 1 European champions, consisting of some of Europe's greatest talent. Swanee, Tommy, Jerd, and Madcap make up this roster, and it's a team that loves to play a strategical game in which they can control the game and the tempo. Up against them is the CWL Season 1 North American champions in OpTic Gaming, consisting of Crimsix, Scumpy, Formal, and Karma. This team excels at outslaying its opponents and dominating with an aggressive playstyle. Unfortunately, due to a problem with the game, we didn't see a full ban and protect. We only got to see the stock, overclock, flash, HCXD, and concussion taken away. We can only assume that based on previous metas, high caliber and rapid fire were taken away as well. So unfortunately, I didn't find out what the 8th ban or protect was. Now, there's a major talking point about stock here as it becomes a big part of the American meta to use it on submachine guns for strafing capabilities. The EU side hasn't quite got there with using it just of yet, and the whole of OpTic use this. And considering Breach is a massively SMG-based map, with every hill indoors as well, it helps neutralize those subs, considering that collectively, OpTic may be a bit more confident with their SMG capabilities than Millenium. Breach is a map where all 5 hardpoints are inside the buildings, so it's not necessarily about holding a superior setup. It's one of the few hardpoint maps that can be won simply by holding the hill. So it's hard to maintain a setup where your AR players can play an active role in the hill action. They're mainly watching lines of sights, holding spawns, and watching for flanks. Getting involved in the hill becomes even more difficult when you take away stock, as the ARs will tend to play more static to compensate for the inability to strafe and aiming around corners. Millenium are a team that like to play a structured game. They rely on a good setup to keep charge of the game and lock their opponents out, which is something they excel in. OpTic are an aggressive, in-your-face team that tend to outslay their opponents. Based on this information, we can get an idea of what the two teams may get up to. Millenium are going to look to try to control the game with a structured setup on the hills, utilizing those 2 ARs, while OpTic are going to be aggressive with their SMGs and look to outslay their opponents. The first hill of the match was all about control. Millenium broke very early on with a baiting tactic, picking up those first initial kills, allowing OpTic to be aggressive. With them being aggressive, they picked up the kills and were able to isolate the rest of the team, and able to pick up the hill and get early points on the board. They also had the stronger side going into this hill because they had those starting P2 spawns, being able to spawn the back labs ready for the second hard point. The second hill was much more of a stalemate. Only 6 points separated the two sides. And overall, Millenium managed to get the better spawns throughout the duration of the hill and contested the hardpoint much better. However, some individual brilliance from Crimsix allowed OpTic extra time on that hill. An early rotation saw OpTic control the money hill. Some individual plays from Scump gave them the momentum, and when Millenium found themselves unable to break the hill, they opted for an early rotation in which OpTic took the lead. And another one-sided hill for Millenium gave them back the lead, in which they held the spawns throughout, and control was dominated by Millenium. Despite OpTic breaking even on kills with Millenium, they couldn't make the kills that broke the hill in the end. The final hill of the half was another strong performance from Millenium. Despite the early rotation from OpTic, Millenium made important kills to maintain those spawns, forcing OpTic to repeatedly run a marathon across the map. And going into the second half, Millenium had a 51-point lead. What you're seeing on the screen are some stats I pulled out from the game itself. The first column displays the team's KDs. They're broken up hill by hill to show you each hill and how they matched up, as well as the totals overall at each point. The next column shows the number of times the two teams got an optimal spawn in the 60 seconds of the hill. I've determined an optimal spawn being a spawn that is generally closer or on the better side of the hill. It also displays the total optimal respawns in the match. The last column shows how much hill time was gained each hill independently, as well as the score total after each hill. Taking a look at the Hardpoint scores per hill, Millenium won 4 out of the 5 of those hills, 3 of which were by a margin of 23 points or more. Now, was that because they were being outslayed? If you look at the KDs of the two teams per hill, they weren't heavily being outslayed. 2 out of the 5 kills, they actually broke even. If we scan our path across to the optimal respawn column, it's a sea of red. In total, 29 more optimal respawns went in the favour of Millenium. It would suggest that Millenium had better control of the spawns and the hill. Without the control of the spawns, OpTic are spawning further away and giving up more time. They cannot capitalise effectively on the kills they're making, and when they're being outslayed, it's due to Millenium's setup. The hills OpTic lost that they didn't have control of the spawns. Millenium got a good rotation off and a strong setup. Millenium are a team that love to control the game, and they do that best with a firm setup. If you can upset that, they can have a tough time keeping the other team in check. For example, on the third hill, which is a hard hill to have a standard hardpoint setup for, it's almost a free-for-all in the hill. OpTic won the hill as they weren't needing to challenge a setup that Millenium had for their original game plan. It was basically negated at that point because of that hill. P2 is another example of why OpTic disrupted the Millenium setup, and it resulted in only a 6-point difference overall on that hill. All the other hills, they couldn't dislodge Millenium from their positions. OpTic realized the next half they need to disrupt those setups as best they can. If they were unable to do that, they need to prioritize the hill where the SMGs are really going to shine and force Millenium to start making moves. You can actually see how important the AC platform becomes for OpTic, putting heavy priority on it as Scump dies towards the beginning of the hill and Crimsix eventually picking up the kill on Swanee to give them control. Now, for the first time, OpTic are consistently getting good spawns. Their priority is to hold that top AC platform to give them the back lab spawns. Millenium don't want to stay stagnant or set up on the opposite side of the map. That doesn't do much for them there. They start throwing bodies towards the hill, and it's a massive tug-of-war between the two teams. Now, if you watch the mini-map, there was a lot more emphasis on the hill from Millenium than looking for those spawns. I'm guessing that they feel if they can keep a lead going into the second one, it will force OpTic to make more mistakes. Or if they abandon the hill pressure for too long, OpTic would get comfortable and lock them out. The few occasions that Millenium did break the enemy lines, they were thwarted and forced to spawn all the way out, not really giving them much to work with going into the next hill. Now, if we take a look at the stats, after the 6th hill, you see that OpTic make a lot more kills. Their highest slaying hill in the entire match, as it turns out. The hill was all about disrupting Millenium's flow and keeping them on their toes. OpTic held a strong line to keep Millenium spawning out, and as a result, they picked up a marginal point lead. Now, Millenium are only 80 points away from victory at this point, so OpTic need to keep the pressure up on the hill. To kick things off this hill, Karma makes a heroic 2-piece to stop the flank and lock out the palace spawns, forcing Millenium to spawn all the way into Greenhouse. He's also freeing up Formal to sweep the side of the cages with the M8. Formal picks up 2 kills and backs out before spotting Jerd. Jerd actually wastes his heat wave, which is important for breaking hills, but picks up a 3-piece for his efforts before falling. At this point, the spawns have swapped, taking out Karma, and Formal has freed up the palace spawn for Millenium, which is a tremendous individual play for Jerd. The next 30 seconds aren't necessarily about the spawn control, it's about flooding the hill and providing support for Crimsix to gain the time for OpTic to be able to get back into the game and then rotate for the money hill. They're not interested in wasting their time on spawns because it's a relatively even foot race at that point. They're just happy spawning on this side of the map as it also gives them the better spawns going into P3.
Set up for it, picks up one, still going to be challenged, taken out from the side. You're going to have, I believe, Crimsix going for it as well.
Looking once again at the stats, OpTic made a 45-0 point comeback, putting them within 2 points of Millenium overall. It was again a hill that they managed to outslay Millenium in making those important kills when they mattered. Even with Millenium arguably spawning up more frequently on the better side, it didn't make the difference as OpTic held them out for better control of the hill. OpTic get to the next hill very late as they made that final stand at the previous hill. Crimsix actually does 2 things with this maneuver off of the billboards. By going on the wall run, he allows his team time to regroup and pinch the hill by providing a distraction while he comes in from the back. But what he also does is as he touches down on a generator platform, a Millenium player spawns up in Greenhouse. So he gains the good spawns for OpTic and forces Millenium to spawn all the way out across the map. So he's able to push through the back unnoticed and gives OpTic the time to get control of the hill. And at this point, Millenium are pushing the hill one by one, and it rarely works out in Hardpoint. It's not really the way to go forward on Hardpoint. It's about pushing together as a team and trading away effectively, and it forces them to spawn sporadically across the map as a result. OpTic set themselves up on this hill so well and aren't letting anyone in, forcing Millenium to go for another early rotation. Once again, looking at the stats, OpTic have outslayed Millenium, bringing the KD totals for the two teams to a 1 kill advantage to OpTic. Looking at the respawns, barely any were made by both of those teams. OpTic weren't really interested in the spawns. They knew they could lock out the hill and didn't need them as a result. Millenium knew that holding the good spawns weren't really going to do a lot for them, and at this point they needed to get the bodies into the hill. Unfortunately for them, that didn't work out, and for a second successive hill, that OpTic managed to gain a 30-point total and finally took the lead since P3. A nervy first few moments of this hill as the spawns were sporadic. Jerd spawns up on the back labs and he pushes through mid to catch out Scump. It's then traded away by Karma. Madcat gets the call and aggressively pushes the front of the greenhouse to pick up the kill, but doesn't know that Crimsix is sat outside. This move actually leaves them with less numbers in the hill and forced an OpTic player to spawn out on the palace, which had it worked out would have been detrimental to the spawns. Fortunately for Millenium, they have control of the spawns and are locking out OpTic. OpTic are now the team that are starting to challenge one by one, and it's an all or nothing tactic that are resulting in some okay trades for OpTic. At this point, Formal makes a god status two-piece with a burst fire AR to break the hill. Millenium have had to throw bodies towards the hill to stop OpTic snowballing, and they've left limited resources behind for the spawns. 3 members of OpTic push the atrium and catch Tommy and Swanee off guard as they're focused on hitting the hill. Their presence blocks the Millenium spawn, and they get the kills off in time for Karma to respawn at the back of the map. The number advantage goes to OpTic, and they start to soak up the time. Millenium challenge back, knowing that OpTic could put themselves a few points off a victory if they grabbed all of the time. Despite OpTic losing out on points total on this hill, the difference was actually only made once Millenium re-challenged the hill. OpTic know going into this next hill, if they locked it down, they can see out the remaining score and win the map. It's again a showing of the fact that when Millenium have control of the spawns, they have control of the hill, and OpTic struggle to outscore them. The circumstances are slightly different in this situation, however, as the next hill is across the map, and the major points difference was gained after OpTic had already rotated. Millenium were going to have to come out of this next hill 19 points behind OpTic, but 41 off of victory, and they are likely aware that they won't look to see the game out on the next hill and will work very methodically to break the hill and earn as much time on this next one as they can. OpTic gain control of the next hill and expect a push from cages. Only Swanee is present, however, and he's picked off very quickly. Meanwhile, Scump and Crimsix are lighting up the show in the hill. Millenium get the palace spawns, and there simply isn't enough time to make the perfect break, and they have to challenge as soon as they get there, allowing OpTic time to dispatch them one by one. Formal pushes round to the AC platform to stop them spawning on the palace, giving them the time to see out the game. Formal calls out the heavy push mid, and Crimsix comes to support his teammate. They both go down and leave the hill open for a retake. OpTic split spawn, and both Formal and Karma challenge the back to provide a distraction. Crimsix comes from the side door and makes the play of the day by catching out Madcat in the doorway. Tommy isn't able to turn quickly enough and is killed. And finally, Jerd is unaware of Crimsix being there. At this point, Millenium are trying to flood the hill as best they can, but Formal in the mid picks up a kill on Swanee, opening the way for Scump to assist Crimsix, and they finally see out the game. OpTic end up outslaying Millenium by 6 kills on that hill. Up until that point, it was completely even. Arguably, those 6 kills that made the difference came from the 2 free pieces that Crimsix managed to pick up on the remaining hill. So how did OpTic pull off the comeback? From my opinion, which you may very well disagree with, and I encourage it, but the first half of the match was a well-controlled game. You can see it clear as day in the first half of the spawn control was heavily in Millenium's camp. 29 more optimal respawns were on the side of Millenium, and it led to OpTic falling to the same problems, and that was losing gunfights on a team that were firmly set up. It's so difficult to take this Millenium lineup off their power positions. Believe me, I've had the unfortunate pleasure of trying to do it against Swanee before. It's not fun. This led to an extremely weighted KD spread in the favour of Millenium 2, as they were just not letting OpTic have anything more than a few meaningless kills, meaning they spawned out regularly and were caught trying to hit back. The second half of OpTic made sure that they played a heavy emphasis on the spores and the control backlabs from P1 leading into P2. This is where they really started to bring the score back for themselves. When they did lose the spores, they knew it wasn't about holding them, it was about holding the hill. They had sussed out their SMG game was stronger, and it forced the Millenium players to take things on their own terms. They simply stopped worrying about what the other team were doing and stacked the hill to rack up the time, as they knew they could compete fine in a hill-based gunfight. You can even see on the player stats, Swanee goes from grabbing 18 kills in the first half to half of that because OpTic cancelled him out of the game by forcing him to come to them. You can also see how much more time the OpTic players got for themselves in the hill in the second half, as well as the fact that Jerd almost had a third of his first half's hill time. Overall, OpTic realized what it was that Millenium wanted and utilized their strengths of hill-based SMG gameplay and negated the AR effect of Swanee and Madcat by not allowing them to have the proper influence on the game by stacking the hills that all were indoors. That was that. I've got so much more detail I could have said about it, but I don't want to absolutely bleed your ears off. If you enjoyed the video, please do drop a like rating and make sure you subscribe. Let me know if you think I should continue doing things like this, or if you've got any game suggestions that you feel I should break down. Hope to see you again soon, and I'll see you later. Peace out.